Okay, friends, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this panel on law and traditionalism. And here's your little pro tip. Here's how you know this is the best panel of the conference. Is for 25 years, this conference has struggled with what to do with panels during the Notre Dame game, because it's always been, on an away game. So what they figured is if this group is so impressive and prestigious that they knew you would come even though the Irish are on TV.
I mean, smartphones help.
Yeah, and so we're gonna have kind of a special rule is that during the remarks, if the Irish score, you're allowed to stand up and let us know. And you don't have to do the whole fight song and no push-ups, but just keep us posted. Nobody comes.
We actually just did score.
Oh, there you go. Nobody comes to these things to hear the introductions, so I'm not going to give them, although I have some really long bios. You guys have read the stuff. You know how distinguished my friends here are. We're going to start with Sharif Gergis, my colleague at Notre Dame Law School. We'll then move on to Jeffrey Pojanowski, my colleague at Notre Dame Law School. And then we'll move on to the guy who has the coolest academic title in the country, the John Henry Newman Chair from Catholic University, Mark DiGirolamo. Sharif, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rick, for that kind introduction. And thanks to...
I am, in fact, Sharif.
I am Sharif. Thanks to the co-panelists. I learned most of what I think about jurisprudence from stealing and teaching Jeff Pojanowski's Juris Syllabus, and I learned almost everything I know about tradition and the law from reading Mark DiGirolamo's stuff before going on to disagree with it in print. And I'm especially excited to be speaking at the fall conference. I'm married into a Notre Dame family, so I've been coming to these for years. One of the things I love about them is that they tend to combine pretty nicely experts who are knee-deep in the material for decades and non-professionals who have the heart and mind to bring intellectual and moral seriousness to a new topic, and novices who are just trying something out in a sort of safe space among learned friends. And sometimes that's all combined in a panel, and in my case, it's going to be combined in one person, because I have some legal training, but no theological training, and I'm going to talk to you about the differences and similarities between traditionalism in law and in theology, hoping that you can correct me on the theology, and using this as an opportunity to play out an idea I've been thinking about over the last few years. So in theology, I'm a Catholic, and in law, I'm an originalist of some sort, a constitutional originalist, which means that I think that constitutional doctrine should be rooted in and constrained by the founding, the original understanding of the text at the founding. And as a Catholic, I think that theology should be rooted in and constrained by the stuff that was laid down at the founding of the church, the deposit of faith that was handed once and for all to be delivered by the saints. Okay, that's my paraphrase of scripture. As a Catholic, that's the best I can do. So let me tell you about 6 or 7 similarities in how tradition plays a role in the development of the doctrine in these two areas, which are still somehow supposed to be tethered to the founding. 1 or 2 big differences, and how reflection on all of that has tempered my commitment to originalism, but strengthened my faith in Catholicism. Okay, so some of the similarities, many of the similarities have been remarked on a lot. I'm not saying anything new when I describe them. Obviously, in both domains, for one thing, there is a supremacy to an original text. Nothing in Catholic theology has the status that the scriptures have, and nothing in constitutional law, at least for an originalist, has the status that the text of the Constitution has. But also you quickly discover, once you begin studying either of these fields, that it doesn't end with the text, that practices play a crucial role. There are many domains of constitutional law where we say, the president has always done this, so he must have the authority to do it, or Congress has never done this, so they must lack the authority to do this. And we do similar things in theology. As I was becoming Catholic, I was reading about Catholic apologetics, and I saw people appeal to the fact that, for example, Pope St. Clement in the year 90 wrote letters to other dioceses telling other bishops what to do, but not vice versa, and maybe that supports the idea that Peter has some primacy, even if the New Testament doesn't say so in exactly so many words. Okay, already you're moving a little bit away from a kind of pure originalist attachment to the text in both domains. It might feel comfortable enough when the practices are early practices. For example, in constitutional law, we say, well, the Congress that gave you the First Amendment also began its sessions with legislative prayer, so that must be okay under the First Amendment. and maybe Pope St. Clement in the year 90, Peter's relatives are probably still alive. That's like very early, that we like that. But in both domains, you also quickly discover that we look to much later practice as well. So maybe the Didache tells you contraception is wrong, depending on your interpretation of pharmakeia or whatever. Well, you're going to have to wait till the 1980s to learn that IVF is wrong from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. And there are similar moves in constitutional law. The big presidential powers case called Zivotofsky about the president's special authority in foreign affairs. It has to wait till Woodrow Wilson's presidency to begin finding the practice that it leans on to articulate those boundaries. Okay, so it's a little unwieldy, but then you're reassured by the fact that there's an ultimate interpreter in both domains. In theology for a Catholic, obviously it's the Catholic magisterium, the Pope and the bishops in union with him. And in law, de facto, this is controversial, but it's become the case that the Supreme Court is treated as the ultimate authority for most purposes. Tempering that in both cases is the fact that both of them are officially supposed to be subject to the ultimate authority of the original founding deposit. So the Supreme Court has no more power than the Constitution gives it, and no power beyond the interpretation of that Constitution. And for Catholics, the same thing goes for the magisterium. There are no new revelations. It's only an unpacking and unfolding of what was laid down by the time of the death of the last apostle. But complicating that commitment to a kind of originalism, even in the face of development, is the fact that the moves that get made in interpretation of the scriptures by the magisterium, of the Constitution by the Supreme Court, are not pure deduction. It's not always like the Constitution says each state gets 2 senators, Delaware is a state, I guess they get 2 senators, or the early teachings, the Didache says all intentional killing of the innocent is wrong, and these Native Americans that we just met the day before yesterday are innocent people, so killing them is wrong. Very often the development is what logicians would call ampliative. It's not deduction, where the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises. It's abduction, or it's judgments of fittingness. So if Luke says, as I think he does say pretty clearly, that Our Lady is the new ark, well, then maybe it follows, or it's fitting, or it makes sense that she'd be immaculately conceived, and if both of those are true, maybe that she would be assumed into heaven. But none of that follows logically by a guarantee. And the same thing is true of a bunch of constitutional doctrine. Originalists like to say that there's a unitary executive. If the president has the executive authority and everybody else in the executive branch exercises his authority, well, then it stands to reason that he should be able to fire them. But again, it's not compelled by the premises. You could come out the other way. So in practice, what happens is what we tend to call common law reasoning, but I think you see it in theology too, where it's to some extent a deduction from statements that are explicit in the past, but to a great extent a sort of reconstruction of the principles behind a bunch of practices, a sort of weighted average of different authorities, a pursuing of dominant lines of practice or precedent in the favor of over and above minority strains. So we believe in just war theory because pacifism was a minority movement, and so on. And all that might make you anxious. And as I was becoming a Catholic and becoming an originalist, it made me anxious. And I found myself wondering, why did we have to do the practice part of all of this? Why couldn't we just have Scripture? It always feels a little weaselly to say Scripture and tradition, and the tradition is like handed down by the bishops, but then you wonder, is it like a 2,000-year game of telephone? Like, how do they know? And if they know, then why didn't they write it down? If the Scriptures had been a little bit longer, could we have just done Scripture and not also tradition? Or if the Constitution had been longer, if they had spent another summer in Philadelphia, could the text cover all the metes and bounds of the doctrine that gets developed by practice over time? And one response to this in law is to say, well, you've misunderstood the enterprise. Because what was laid down, what was given to us by the founders, was not just a text or propositions, but actually a form of government and practices. So Frankfurter in Youngstown says, it is an inadmissibly narrow conception of American constitutional law to limit it to the text on the page and to disregard the gloss which life has written upon the words. And that idea of gloss and practice as being part of what we received suggests that it could not have been laid down in the text. Why? Because practices are concrete things, and they cannot be reduced to a text. We say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you stared at a picture for days and days and wrote down everything you could about it, you wouldn't capture everything that's in it, and a picture is just 2-dimensional. Practices are 4-dimensional. They exist over time and space, and so all the more difficult would it be to reduce it to a page. And if that's true in law, perhaps it's true in theology. And when I looked back at Dei Verbum and other documents of the Second Vatican Council, I saw that that's exactly what the church teaches. Dei Verbum in paragraph 8, which is the one that mentions living tradition, the title of this conference, says at one point that what was laid down by the apostles includes not just their teachings, but everything which contributes to the holiness of the church. It's what the believing and practicing church identifies. It's basically the whole set of practices and beliefs that constituted the early church, that are part of the deposit. They could not even in principle have been reduced to text if they include practices, which gives you a kind of new gloss to the end of John's gospel, where he says, if I tried to write down everything that Christ did, all the books in the world wouldn't contain it. That's not just Semitic hyperbole on this picture. That's like a fundamental metaphysical truth about the irreducibility of the practices we receive from Christ to a bunch of text. Okay, but now, having reconciled myself to the necessity of practice in some way, learning a little bit more about how tradition worked in constitutional law created anxieties for me on the theological side. Why? Because one of the first things you learn as you dive into the court's cases where it's looking a bunch at practice is that there's something called the levels of generality problem. And it's fiendish and it feels insoluble. To just give you a concrete example, the court says that the contours of the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms are given by early practices about what laws were allowed, the ratifying generation adopted. And now we have to look at those practices and tease out from them a principle about the limits of the Second Amendment. So the court did this recently in a case where it looked at laws that banned the brandishing of dangerous or unusual weapons in public to terrify the public. Now, what principle about the limits of the Second Amendment do those laws represent? Do they just represent the permissibility of those laws, or of all laws that are supposed to disarm dangerous people, or of all laws that are supposed to save lives? If it's the last thing, then almost any gun regulation goes. If it's the first thing, then almost nothing goes. And what I came to think over time was that there is, in principle, no single correct level of generality at which to read a practice. Practices, because they're complex and concrete in the way I described, can be described broadly or narrowly, and there's nothing in the world, in the physical domain, in space-time, that's going to tell you which description is correct. If there's something that's going to tell you which description is correct, it's a mental state. It's a belief or intention of the people engaged in that practice. And the problem is that I think the more you look at these tradition-based constitutional law cases, the more you realize that there are very many cases where it's extremely implausible that people ever thought about the issue we're now looking to their practices to answer, or that they disagreed with each other, or that they never adverted to the question, and extremely implausible in any event that by looking at a finite set of practices from the ratification era or what have you, you're going to get anything like a complete set of contours for a constitutional norm, even just like the Second Amendment, let alone the rest of the document. And you can see how that creates problems on the theological side. Because if we look at the fact that for the first 30 years, let's say, they only ever ordained Middle Eastern men as priests. And we look at that practice and we say, well, the male part was essential, the Middle Eastern part was not essential. How do we know? If they never mentioned anything about it, if they never adverted to the question, what is it about the practice that we are teasing out to find the principle that tells us maleness is essential and Middle Easternness is not? And if that's true, then you can't hold on to the Catholic idea that everything developed in doctrine legitimately was in some sense present already by the death of the last apostle. We're not that insistent on it in the law. We don't say everything in constitutional doctrine has to have been present by the death of James Madison in 1826. But we do say that about theology, and it's essential to the Catholic claim to authority. So how does it work? How does there come to be a correct level of generality in the past? And here is where I came to think that there is a deep difference between tradition and practice and theology versus law. In theology, I told you the deposit of faith I came to see included not just propositions, but also practices. But what practices were those? Those were the practices of the faith, of the early church. What was laid down, what was founded, what was handed on was a covenant, the church that Christ founded. Now, what is the church? The church is his body, and the church as his body comes to persist through time, which means that all along the way, there is a person behind the practices. That person has a mind, and he has thought about every feature of those practices because he happens to be omniscient. In fact, that person happens to be identical to the word, the proposition, God's own self-knowledge. So when the church does something, even if you can't count up heads and say, well, the majority of them thought they were doing X, there is a true fact, more than just a fiction as in law, about what belief or intention lay behind the practice. It's the belief or intention of Christ. And when you look back at Dei Verbum again, as I did this morning to see if this was borne out anywhere, you find them saying explicitly that the deposit of faith is not just practices and propositions, but a person. Jesus perfected revelation by fulfilling it through his whole work of making himself present and manifest. It's Christ the Lord in whom the full revelation of supreme God is brought to completion. And so that's one difference, is that there is a truth maker in the deposit that was left by the death of the last apostles. The deposit of faith is not just practices or propositions, but a person. It's Christ himself. And it's the same Christ who persists through time in his corporate form on earth in the body of the church. And that brings me to the second big difference. I said earlier in a kind of dismissive, qualified way that the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution, according to our practice, is the Supreme Court. And on the Catholic side, it's the magisterium. When you see, as I came to see, or at least think I see, that the practices that the Supreme Court is interpreting, the interpretations are a bit of a noble fiction. It's telling us this was really the principle that was there in the past, which is really just a creative reconstruction, not something that was there in people's minds. You can reconcile yourself to the Supreme Court being ultimate and supreme anyway by just saying, well, we need a coordinating device. Law needs to get us all on the same page. Supreme Court happens to be somebody everybody listens to. So it's a benign fiction to treat their benign fictions as the true law that was laid down at the founding. But I don't want to do that with the church. And it turns out I don't have to, because the last thing I just said gives an answer to the second puzzle, too, of why the magisterium has special authority. Remember, I said that the truth maker behind the practices that makes it the case that one aspect of the practice was essential and the other wasn't is the mind of Christ, because the practices are the new covenant, which just is the church, which just is his body united to his person, which is the word. Well, now, if the magisterium is the head of his body on earth, and his body on earth is Christ, then when the magisterium speaks, Christ speaks, which is why he's able to say to his apostles, he who hears you hears me, in a way that Madison could not say to the Supreme Court, he who hears you hears me. And it's why the act of faith, the traditional act of faith for Catholics, which says, I believe that all that the Holy Roman Catholic Church teaches because you revealed that qui nec fallere nec falle potest, you who can neither deceive nor be deceived. The very truth maker of the proposition of faith is Christ. And it's the same truth maker that you are hearing directly when, in his corporate form on earth, he speaks through his head on earth, which is the Pope and the bishops in union with them. Christ in his individual form never met Arius, but Christ in his corporate form through time met Arius and answered him at the Council of Nicaea, and so on for all of the other propositions that in a legitimate development of doctrine we get through the church's teaching. Final point, how do we know that there's no illegitimate change? On the law side, it's another benign fiction. And on the theological side, we know it because the truth maker, who's also the source of the clarification in the magisterium, is Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So it's his own steadiness, which makes it the case that when the Catholic Church develops a doctrine in the ways that the Church has said it develops doctrine, we have an infallible guarantee, something as sure as deduction, that what we're hearing is what was laid down in the deposit of faith at the death of the last apostle. Thank you.
Professor Gerges, thank you. I won the bet. At 14 minutes, you actually did consult a note. So, Professor Pojanowski.
All right, well, thank you, Rick. As said in the introduction, I am Jeff Pojanowski. I'm privileged to be here with two of the most important and prominent scholars on law and tradition. Professor DiGirolamo has literally written the book on law and tradition, forthcoming soon. And Professor Gerges has been the most insightful analyst and sometimes critic of the Supreme Court's use of history and tradition in constitutional interpretation. And has already been noted, or at least adverted to, The Supreme Court and its critics have been focusing intensely on traditional practices in its work. So it's apt that we are here today. Initially, I planned to talk about two topics concerning the relationship between tradition and interpretation of legal texts, like statutes and constitutions, but I've decided to pitch my discussion a little more broadly. My talk today will be a little more general, more gestury, and more outside of my realm of academic expertise. But you can at least reassure yourself that on Earth 2, you would have been listening to me talk about how legal tradition is consistent with the artifact theory of law, on one hand, and on the other hand, the challenges of understanding original unwritten general law as a backdrop to the Constitution. You'd be better off watching a football game. Broader musings can be more fun or at least less boring here, and certainly more apt for this kind of conference, which pitches at intelligent generalists. Now, as Professor DiGirolamo has noted in his past work and in his upcoming book, there's a hunger for tradition in law and in our culture more generally. We see it in the law with the Supreme Court's embrace of history and tradition in constitutional interpretation, and with legal scholars' increasing interest in unwritten general law, which is much more traditional in character than explicitly posited norms like statutory texts, or constitutional provisions. But we see it beyond law, especially among young people. The long-running decline in religiosity among young people has actually reversed, showing a moderate uptick for the first time in decades. At this conference 2 years ago, I remember speaking to a participant who was in his 50s, who went to Mass in the crypt of the Basilica and was surprised and scandalized to see so many young people receiving communion on their knees. I explained to him that in these very untraditional times, when religiosity is an option, people choosing it want the strong stuff. And there's promise to this return. I send my youngest son to a classical Catholic school with daily Mass for a reason. But as with so many possibly good things, there's also peril. There is, of course, the perennial danger of antiquarianism and living in an imagined past. The young fogey is a stock character and a figure of mockery for a reason. More worrisome is the embrace of tradition as a mere angry rejection of what the culture has on offer, even if that offering surely merits rejection. If return is spelled with a V and lived online via a medieval knight social media avatar that owns the libs, there's a strange combination of nostalgia and violence, a mosh pit version of Morris dancing. We do not want tradition to be a skin suit for nihilism, a funhouse mirror version of left anarchists wearing Guy Fawkes masks and singing the old Spanish Civil War songs. And the very forces that make us long for tradition also make it harder to find true tradition and its goods. In a recent bracing and pessimistic book, The Crisis of Culture, French political scientist Olivier Roy argues that the disorientation we face today is not from rapid change of culture, but the end of the possibility of culture completely. And by culture, he means shared implicit understandings with respect to mores and ways of life, an accepted canon of works and knowledge to pass on, and a shared social imaginary. He contends that with globalization, the triumph of subcultures and mass culture, and postmodern doubt of meta-narratives, including religious ones, we're in a situation of what he calls deculturation without acculturation to something new. Unlike some religious believers and communitarians, he is skeptical about our ability to go back. Now, one doesn't have to be as pessimistic as Roy to recognize the challenge of our scattering times. And our challenge is not made easier by some attempts to push back against anti-traditional forces. As the Oxford music professor Lola Salem argued in a recent essay, Renewing Culture for the Right, you cannot critique, dunk, or meme your way back into a social habitus worth living in. You need to propose something real, solid, authentic, compelling, and beautiful. Which is where law finally comes in. It may sound bizarre to link law and legal traditions with beauty. And I, for one, have limited tolerance for romantic tributes to the majesty of the law and some such stuff. But I would like to assert that law and legal teaching and scholarship, when done right, remains a stubborn cultural redoubt where one can find shared implicit understandings, a canon, and a shared social imaginary. Consider the first year of law school. Across the country, you will find a required curriculum, canonical cases, and a common vocabulary and set of concepts. First-year students will not have those implicit understandings and shared imaginary the first time they sit down in their seats. But by the end of the semester, and certainly by the end of the year, they will indeed be acculturated, and that's what makes the first year of legal education both exciting and at times disorienting. I'll also argue that this tradition can also be beautiful and even elegant for a certain kind of mind. Take a torts class. If well taught, and I strive to teach my version of it well, students will see more than a farrago of accidents, invocations of reasonableness, or rules to memorize. They will appreciate how reasonableness serves different functions in different contexts. They'll see how disparate elements of individual torts hang together, trace implicit patterns of moral commitment across different torts, and be initiated into mysteries and arguments about whether and how doctrinal anomalies fit in, should be excised, modified, or be allowed to hang on as vestigial remainders that are inevitable for any non-rationalistic practice. And when it's done even better, they'll appreciate how there can be arguments within the practice of tort law about what makes the practice excellent, how it can be reformed within those terms, and to recognize forms of argument and theories that are inimical to the practice. Now, to beauty, I once remember hearing about a math teacher who wept when he first appreciated the fundamental theorem of calculus. I've never come close to that in a torts class, but there is, I think, something beautiful about stepping back after the Paulsgraf case and seeing a finely carved Rosetta Stone or skeleton key for understanding the traditional structure of tort law, what you see in the majority opinion, and its modern interpretive rival in the dissent. The enterprise becomes even more satisfying, at least to me, when you can see how that doctrinal structure, which is subject, of course, to permissible contingent variations across jurisdictions and systems, but how that structure can fit into a broader system of natural law and instantiates obligations of interpersonal justice and the imperfect conditions of human law and life. Now, contrary to some Kantian private law theorists, there's no Platonic form of tort law in all its particulars, but there's a rough, deep structure that labors to order our affairs in a veil of tears. It's justice in work clothes, and like all garments, subject to some particularity and variation depending on the wearer. But that tailoring, mending, and patchwork over time is what makes a pair of clothes mine rather than yours. Now, what I've said for tort law can be well said for other legal subjects. Sharif could say the same about constitutional law, Rick about criminal law, and the like. If tradition is the intentional handing on of something from the past that has a living claim on us today, law and law teaching, again, when done well, do that in spades. There are many ways to do it poorly, including a kind of rigidity that denies that tradition can develop over time as it incrementally incorporates moral wisdom and addresses new problems. But that vice is not the most prominent ill, at least in elite legal culture. Challenges to healthy traditionalism in law often come from the other pole of our antinomy here. Oliver Wendell Holmes, for example, sought to theorize law on reductive Darwinian terms. Legal realism in its crudest form sought to expose legal doctrine as raw policy preferences, masquerading as mystery. And critical legal studies, while rejecting the picture of legal tradition I've sketched above, saw it the most accurately in some respect, even if one does not think unsavory class, racial, or gender politics poison our law to its roots. The crits diagnosed correctly that teaching law along traditional lines indeed has an implicit politics and metapolitics, that there are value judgments not just beneath the particular doctrinal rules, but in the way we attend to, defend, or develop those rules. For a person who rejects those implicit politics, or for those who reject reform in favor of revolution, law and law at law school can in fact be alienating. Yet, despite the best efforts of more than 100 years of would-be academic revolutionizing, much of the old science remains in place. You would not believe that if you were to read the articles in top law reviews or peruse the table of contents of most of the most recent issues of the Journal of Legal Education. But those periodicals are also littered with recrimination and laments about the tenacity in which the old ways of teaching and thinking about law hang on. We teach a lot of the same old cases with a new smattering of policy analysis and critique, but in the hands of most teachers, those innovations tend to hover around the edges, like a Greek chorus bemoaning a play that eternally recurs. Even for the California Supreme Court, that most non-traditional of courts, even they cannot resist the pull of tradition in its efforts to change. For example, in the Tarasoff case, the court sought to impose a new duty on psychiatrists to warn third parties whom they have reason to believe will be endangered by their patients. In good, skeptical, legal realist fashion, the court led with a block of dicta rejecting traditional analysis and understanding of negligence duties, and intoned how conclusions of duty are the mere residue of policy balancing among seven factors. In the end, however, they undertook little explicit policy balancing, but more humbly stretched a duty to warn that already existed under old doctrinal science and cited some other cases that had done so similarly. In sum, despite the efforts of realists and crits, the practice persists and even revives, as evidenced by the rediscovery of tradition in unwritten law and public law, and the close attention to doctrinal categories in the new private law movement. One could wonder why law and law teaching remain so resistant to the forces of anti-culture. Part of it is the brute fact that law students need to pass the bar and attend to the needs of clients whose problems will be resolved in the thicket of practices and rules that legal institutions still maintain. One cannot say the same for, say, anthropology, or sadly in some places that aren't Notre Dame, theology. Ironically then, it may be that law's professional school status helps it maintain more of its intellectual center of gravity against the academy's centrifugal forces of dissolution. 2 cheers for the bar exam and vocationalism, if not for the ABA and Hornbook manualism. But that might only push back the question a step. If lawyers and judges gave up this traditional cast of thinking, it would not behoove law schools and students to follow suit. Why do they? At least to some extent. Part of it, I suspect, is the very nature of the discipline of law, where authority, stability, consistency, coherence, and role morality are simply built into the character of the practice and distinguish it from politics and ethics, even though it's never fully separated from those. Law is a particular subdivision of practical reasoning where first-order questions of justice and the common good are filtered through and conditioned by such second-order stabilizing conditions. Those who think law should be unburdened by the dead hand of the past do not, in an important sense, understand the enterprise. This does not, of course, mean that law and the practices we have are immune from criticism, though such imperfections call for reform rather than revolution. Again, this is the implicit politics of law that critical legal scholars were correct to diagnose, but wrong to decisively reject. Nor does it mean that tradition in law is safe from the world around it. There are judges writing clickbaity opinions, scornful bloggers, scoffing podcasters, and hot take tweeters, and students primed to listen. There are large language models seeking to mass produce a simulacrum of the craft. Après la resistance of torts, le déluge, perhaps. But if feats like the medieval preservation and subsequent revival of Roman law shows us anything, it is that steady, often thankless work of patient scholarship and steady teaching can provide sound footing on dry land. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pojanowski. He's asked me to tell all of you that his new Red Dirt country band, the Hot Take Tweeters, is playing downtown tonight. Professor DiGirolamo.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I always love coming to Notre Dame so much, and to be among very great scholars whose work I have long admired and who are among the best of my friends. It's such a pleasure for me to disagree with my friends. Truly, it's a gift, a blessing of a person's life to be able to do that. And I want to also take a moment to thank Professor Martin for selecting this topic. It's such a rich and wonderful topic, and I've so enjoyed listening to the panels and to the discussions that I've heard. I want in this little talk to reflect on a problem for traditionalism in the law and perhaps for tradition in contemporary society. Many problems have been raised for the sort of systematic reliance on tradition in American constitutional law of the kind that I have advocated. In general, these have been doctrinal or conceptual objections. And on the legal technical side, and that's as it should be, law is a technical discipline. It's a discipline of techne, or skill in craftsmanship, as Jeff so eloquently said. The problem I want to sketch today is sociological or cultural, and it concerns what I will call the need for submission. To be traditional and to value tradition is to submit to existing forms of authority, structure, and knowledge external to oneself. A person degrades, in the sense of grading as less important, his or her will for the sake of obedience to some other power that is thought to be greater than that person. And certainly in the modern period, but perhaps always, that self-degradation has a cost. I bind myself to a way of life, and I am disabled from other projects that I might wish to undertake, from doing what I want to do when I want to do it. We might say that to follow a tradition, I have to accept a self-imposed disability. That self-imposed disability might be described as manifesting a kind of autonomy. When Ulysses bound himself to the mast so as not to be drawn against his will toward the sirens, we could say that he was exercising autonomy in a more complete or full way than he would have had he simply acceded to his more immediate desires. But whether it's an exercise of autonomy or an exercise, as I believe, of submission to higher authority, really a kind of heteronomy, of control by other wills, older wills, to whom one submits one's autonomy, disability can have great value. That, I think, is kind of interesting in its own right, the notion that disability has a value, a worth. Nevertheless, for a tradition to be attractive, the benefit I receive from submission to these other authorities needs to be somehow worth the cost, worth a high enough or good enough or noble enough payout. But the very concept of the noble and submission to the noble, to the higher and to the better, is a special problem for contemporary Americans, even for those Americans who work in places and institutions whose very existence depends upon hierarchies of value and patterns of discrimination, perhaps especially for such Americans. When we think of tradition, we think of something received, not personally created, curated, or chosen. Jeff mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and I do think to say a little something nice about Holmes, and in Holmes's terms, tradition is one of those can't helps, ways of thinking and doing that we accept as givens, that we cannot imagine changing. I was recently in Florence, which is the site of, among other things, my family's ancestral home. My wife and I took a photograph of the Via de Girolami, located right off of the Ponte Vecchio crossing the Arno River, and we were fortunate enough to meet with a Florentine di Girolami, of whom I had not previously been aware, who still lives in a residence on that very street. And when I asked him why the family had remained, he said, well, we could never leave. The Di Girolami have been in this place since the 11th century. Just a footnote, that may have been an embellishment, kind of reference to sort of time immemorial. Still, I will say there are hard records of a Florentine cardinal who lived on that street, Raffaele Cosimo de Girolami, dating from the 17th century. He was prefect for the Congregation for Indulgences and Relics. At any rate, coming back to my relation, he said, we've always been here, we will always be here. Our home has claims on us. Now, this family member could have chosen another path. He could have reinvented himself, to use a contemporary phrase, and moved to a rather spacious apartment in Buenos Aires or Manhattan or Hong Kong or really anywhere. But that would have meant a complete break with his friends, family, history, everything he knows and loves. For him and for the family, an unimaginable rupture. This way of thinking is not so common for people in the United States today, and maybe it never has been. We're supposed to be the country of personal liberty and choice. Tradition implies communal and historical limits on all of that, and we don't believe in those things. Children are supposed to leave the geography, physical and psychological and spiritual, in which they once had home and family. We believe in creating our own paths and lighting out for the territory, like Huckleberry Finn. Now that the frontier has closed, we believe in exploring the territories of our inner selves. From what I can gather online about the new trads, all of this also seems true. One of the ironies in 21st century America is that it seems inevitably a matter of personal choice, all of this tradition. One has to choose affirmatively to join one of the many traditions on offer. It's often said that liberalism creates an exit option for people in traditional communities, but I would say that it creates an entrance requirement as well. Now, one might say, and in fact, I have said something like this in response to this objection to my claims for tradition. I'll say, of course, individualism is an important value in US culture. But still, the idea of tradition has much to recommend it, and many people, even many Americans, rely on it constantly, even subconsciously. They rely on it so deeply and it's such fundamental features of their lives that they're likely not even to see it or recognize it for what it is in the way that they eat and drink and think and work and worship and play together. About a decade ago, Sir Roger Scruton gave a lecture as part of a project that I co-directed with my friend, Professor Mark Movsesian, on tradition, in which Sir Roger recommended that I distinguish, and this is the way he put it, quote, trivial from deep traditions, close quote. Among the former of which he included, quote, traditions like Highland dress. Here he probably had Hugh Trevor Roper's excellent essay, The Invention of Tradition, in mind. He continued, the ceremony of lessons and carols, Christmas itself, close quote. Now, I've learned a great deal from Sir Roger's work on tradition and I'm very grateful to it, but on this matter, and actually setting Christmas aside, which Scruton recognized as hardly trivial, I think he was wrong. I think he was deeply wrong. We can learn about the worth of tradition from its smallest and seemingly least significant expressions. Indeed, it is in these little day-to-day matters, the matters of ordinary life, of ordinary citizens, that we can find a kind of keyhole into what might otherwise seem like an inaccessible door. We can learn about tradition by attending to the way we behave together in undistinguished places, in dumps, in homeless shelters, in bars, in chain restaurants, in bodegas, and more. Especially helpful, in my own view, is our relationship to food. Tell me what you eat, the acclaimed French lawyer, judge, and devoted foodie, Jean-Antelme Brillat-Savarin, ooh, that was a tough one to get out, once said, and I will tell you who you are. Tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are. In the kitchen, in the cellar, and the dairy, and the distillery, to be traditional is often thought desirable and admirable. It's to connect to prior worlds by following and perfecting the recipes of old, the methods that endure, that must not be adulterated, that reflect something correct and pure and perfect, something humanly excellent. And so what I'm trying to do in some of this work is to render tradition appealing and to describe its beauty and attraction for a democratic age and a democratic world. Just why is it that the Supreme Court has turned in this direction just now? Many answers may be given. Some justices have claimed, for example, that tradition allows for judicial decisions to be controlled by history rather than by moral judgment. That is not a plausible answer, in my view. A better answer is that the court is looking for something that can bind us, glue us together. And tradition of all things might do that precisely because it is something unlooked for, and yet a powerful subterranean force with surprising appeal. In this sense, I have tried to democratize tradition, to smooth out the lumps that sociological observers of the American character since Tocqueville have so keenly observed. But there's a problem, and it was pointed out to me in an acute way by Professor Pojanowski in response to something I wrote last year. Jeff observed that true traditions, real traditions, such as the great tradition of the Catholic Church, depend upon great men, popes, saints, and so on, to do the authoritative expository work of the tradition. The people need to show that work a proper attitude of deference and respect, even of submission. That submission is reflected in a disposition of participation in the life of the church and adherence to the magisterium. Yesterday, I heard a very good talk by Professor David Schindler in which he rightly emphasized that for scholars like Joseph Pieper, tradition is not a conversation among co-equals. The traditum is handed down by the older and the greater to the younger and the lesser. It is, in fact, the way that the younger and the lesser become the older and the greater. It is a one-way exchange which requires an attitude of submission by the young to the old. And so it is to the saints, Jeff suggested, that we should look for our traditions, not necessarily to the people. Tradition is about truth and beauty and excellence, but many ordinary customs of the common democratic citizen are not about any of these things. And so, if we want people to be formed by the best things of this world and the best things of the next, we will require that they submit to those formative structures of truth and meaning. We will require that they submit to formation by others who are better, greater, nobler than they are. But in the United States, this submission is going to be a problem. First, of course, as a society, we lack a common sense of what is authoritatively good and authoritatively bad. And second, and perhaps even worse, we sometimes even lack that as individuals. The very idea of submission to the higher and the nobler and the elevated, to what and who is superior to oneself, is regarded by many as anathema. Even institutions that are themselves dependent on this type of distinction drawing. And here I think especially of the university and its once rigorous standards of discrimination for what was of high scholarly quality and what is not, have come under great strain through the pressure of the democratic egalitarian spirit so common in America. So the university was once not merely, as Professor David Rabin has put it, a meritocratic institution. It was an aristocratic institution, even as late as the Humboldtian period, whose universities are often taken to be the model for contemporary American universities. Submission to what is better than you just does not sit well in this country. There are some sound reasons, I think, for the collapse of that view, but its collapse has also meant a great loss for the country. Submission to tradition allows people to transcend themselves, to become better or greater or somehow more than they could have been if they had just lived poorer, sadder, smaller lives of relentless self-reinvention. Thank you.
No doubt, because of my skillful moderation, all of our speakers hit it precisely on the nose. So we have lots of time for questions and answers. But Mark, even though you've just sat down and are hydrating, I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about something. A big theme in your remarks just now was this idea of submission. And I take the suggestion to be that true traditionalism or respect for tradition sort of necessarily involve submission to the noble, I think you put it. But what if someone were to say, that's not really what's going on? I like tradition, but for me, it's basically a kind of rule utilitarianism. That I'm traditionalist because, this side of heaven, knowledge is scarce, throw in all your Hayek stuff. Generally speaking, deference to what's been done for a while is gonna yield good results. I'm not submitting in the sense that you suggest, this person might say. I'm simply adopting a strategy that's gonna be efficient. And why would that be an incorrect understanding of traditionalism in your view?
Yeah, so I think if I were to think about the three kinds of ways, or the three overarching reasons that somebody might be attracted to tradition, one is this kind of way, right? That sort of the many minds issue, right? That many minds are likely to have gotten it righter than my lonely mind can get it right now. So even then, you might not put it in these terms as sort of submission, but you are, in a sense, subordinating your view to a kind of sense of a reconstructed past in which lots of other people have thought about a thing. Now, you might just, as you say, take that view because you think, as a general matter, it's going to get you to a better result. But in some ways, that's question begging, because what do we mean by a better result? It might be the case that the many minds get to the better result, but it might not be the case also. What makes a person think that, as a rule, from a rule utilitarian point of view, many minds think better than my mind? Is it because somebody has sort of done the studies, so to speak, or is it just a kind of a presumption that authority is right and good and needs to be listened to? So that's one. There are other justifications. I think that one might, in and of itself, bottom out in a kind of submission, although perhaps not as romantic a way as the way that I described it.
Good. Questions from you all? Mr. Northley.
I may have missed it, but I may have just heard three law professors talk about tradition and law without ever hearing the words stare decisis. I was wondering if you can comment on, is stare decisis an aspect of tradition and law, and if so, what are the factors that can override that presumptive authority?
Yes, it is. I think of stare decisis as a little bit better than practice in one way, which is that practice, or history and tradition as it's sometimes used, refers to practices that didn't come stapled with an essay of legal reasoning explaining the rationale behind them. So with most court cases, you get past actors that you're deferring to who faced the same legal question you're facing, or one closely related to it, reached an answer reflected in who won the case, and gave their reasons. Whereas when you look to early gun regulations to figure out what the contours of the Second Amendment are, for example, in almost all cases, that's not the case. What you have instead is just a bunch of laws that were passed to solve a social problem right in front of the lawmakers, and we assume that they were conscientious and diligent and knew their con law, and were acting based on a background belief about why this regulation was constitutionally permissible, but they didn't state that reason. They didn't write it down, and we don't have access to it. So in that respect, stare decisis is better, and in my view, is entitled to more weight than the lessons of practice in the sense that I was focusing on in the talk. But no justice in history, and no legal scholar that I know of thinks it's absolute. And the question then becomes, how much does it matter? How sufficient is it to just conclude that the precedent was wrongly decided, or badly wrong, or egregiously wrong, as the court sometimes put it, and how much do you need other problems as well? And on the current court, you see a divide on that issue. Justice Thomas at one end of the spectrum saying, as soon as I'm quite confident, as soon as it's clear clearly erroneous or demonstrably erroneous, that's all I need to think that not just that I can, but that actually my oath requires me to overrule the precedent. And maybe at the other end is, well, several other justices who think, no, we need more than that. It needs to be not only the case that it's wrong or badly wrong, but also that it's wrought havoc in other areas of law, that it's had major problems in the real world, and that people have not relied on it to such an extent that we're pulling the rug out from under them by overruling it. That's the form of the debate.
One thing I want to note, I think there's kind of an interesting relationship between tradition and stare decisis. When the common law was at its kind of most kind of old-timey tradition, they did pay attention to precedent and stare decisis, but it was not, prior cases were evidence of what the law was as opposed to constituting the law. It wasn't like a rule that's laid down that you have to follow unless you went, and if you're not going to follow it, you have to kind of replace it with a new rule. At the time when the common law was most traditional, stare decisis was kind of presumptive and kind of a comfortable, kind of a normative, but it was not kind of this fixed set of rules. It would, and on the other hand, and the great legal historian A.W.B. Simpson talks about, once we lose that sense of tradition, that's when people started thinking about stare decisis and precedent in terms of rules. And because when you're in a kind of a traditional community, there are kind of like unspoken ways of doing and understanding and approaching things and consensual, consensus, approaches to things. You don't need to kind of lay down things in rules. It's only when we can't disagree or reason about the good or kind of, speak the same language, we need to kind of make rules. And the kind of the peak of at the time when like precedent became the strongest in early 20th century England, where they attempted to kind of lay down an absolute rule of precedent. It came with the death of kind of the old-fashioned declaratory theory of understanding law. So there's kind of this complicated relationship between the strength of precedent and tradition. And there's almost, in some circumstances, the more traditional your law is, the more likely you're going to kind of follow precedent and maybe shift it only incrementally, but the less likely you're going to kind of treat it as kind of an unquestioning command, which is a different kind of way of being loose with precedent than Justice Thomas is, I think.
I'll just add quickly, it is true that oftentimes stare decisis is associated with tradition. Stare decisis, as Jeff said correctly, is a kind of, it trades on common law style reasoning. And the only additional thing that I'd say is originally, common law style reasoning was about judges trying to discern the law common to all of us. So it was about, in fact, practices, popular practices, regulatory practices. That's the stuff of the common law. There has been a perversion, in my view, of common law reasoning in the 20th century to make it about judicial decisions. That is not what the common law was about. And a true account of stare decisis would go back, it seems to me, just exactly in the opposite way that Professor Gerges suggests, to take account of the customs common to us.
But Mark, can I ask you, just kind of going back to the question I asked you before, should we think of stare decisis as being an example of people, to use your word, submitting to the decisions of prior decision makers on the ground that they're worthy of being submitted to? Or, again, is it kind of a crude cost-benefit thing that all things being equal, stare decisis makes sense, it doesn't unsettle expectations, but it makes it easier to plan? And tradition, it seems to me that how we think about stare decisis as a principle of traditionalism is going to be very different depending on which of those paths in the wood we take.
It could be, I mean, you could say something like this: look, I'm going to presume that a past way of doing things is the correct way. And I agree, you could have a number of, the strength of the presumption could be different, right? If you take a very, very strong presumption of the kind that one might take if you agree with my submission account, or you could take a sort of milder, right? Because as a general matter, all things being equal, many minds do it better than my mind. But either way, you're adopting a presumption in favor of this past way of doing things that doesn't seem to me to necessarily be different in kind. But we can talk some more.
fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much for your awesome talks. Professor DiGirolamo, I wanted to ask you a quick question about the Supreme Court's turn to tradition and constitutional interpretation. So you spoke briefly about potentially defining the turn to tradition in terms of the alternative methods of interpreting the Constitution. And I was curious what the risks are and whether there's maybe a risk of undermining like the inherent value of tradition as a constitutional form of interpretation by defining it in terms of its alternatives, like kind of interest balancing type thing.
Yeah, so I would say, as I mentioned in the talk, one justification, and I have Justice Kavanaugh in mind, actually, one justification for tradition that he has voiced is that it roots constitutional adjudication in history, as if history kind of provides an answer. But of course it doesn't, number one, because history speaks with many different voices. But number two, even if you could identify the particular voice, and I think Professor Gurgis in his comments said this level of generality issue can be quite difficult. Even if you were able to identify the correct level, you still need, as with any field of law, when you're making analogies or when you're deciding whether a new case is on all fours with a previous case or instead differs, those methods of reasoning are moral methods of reasoning. So I think you're quite right to say that by defining it, if I take the question correctly, as totally different than, let's say, interest balancing, because interest balancing that's about morals, right? Or that's about moral, and this thing, tradition, is about history. I think that's wrong. Now, that's not to say that these are exactly the same forms of moral reasoning that are going on, and we could talk about that. But I do think that drawing too sharp a distinction is, I agree with you, not a good idea, but it's a perennial temptation, I think, to do that kind of thing.
Thank you all for your presentations.
Hold on for a second.
Thank you all for your presentations. I thought they were really interesting. My name is Jay. I guess my question is directly to Professor Pojanowski, but other panelists could answer that too. It kind of relies on the intersection between stare decisis, originalism, and then judicial restraint. So, Professor, you mentioned that really nice quote from Felix Frankfurter about Professor Kirsch's mentioned it, about the Youngstown case. And I know Felix Frankfurter had a philosophy of judicial restraint. I'm wondering if it would be possible that you could try to combine stare decisis principles with originalism and judicial restraint. Because to me, it seems that, especially recently, a lot of originalist thinking has gone to, originalism can go against stare decisis, according to some originalist thinkers, but that might be violating some factors of judicial restraint depending on how you define it. So I'm wondering if it's possible to combine all three of those philosophies.
I mean, I can take a whack at that. You're right to note there's some complications, and part of the question is about why you want to be an originalist, right? If you got, the early wave of originalism was like, hey, the Warren Court and the Burger Court have gone nuts. They're running the country. The Constitution doesn't say that. The judges need to get out of this business, right? So you have an argument for we're going to go back to the original document and not do this kind of stuff, this kind of free form, interest balancing that you have, and that's a notion of judicial restraint, right? And now, if you are into originalism for that, but not everyone is into originalism for that. If you're into originalism because you want to be faithful to the original law of the Constitution, it may contingently constrain judges if the Constitution actually gives the political branches lots of room to maneuver and there's not much to strike down. Being an originalist will get you restrained. On the other hand, if the Constitution runs counter to lots of things that legislatures are doing, and your job is to be faithful to the Constitution, it's not restraint to kind of let those bad things happen. You have to kind of follow the law, and if the law tells you to strike things down, you're not being activist; you're just kind of following the law. And both can kind of cut against stare decisis, at least if you have an interpretive regime change. If we move from kind of freewheeling activism to restrained originalism, or freewheeling activism to striking down things in light of the original meaning and stuff like that, you may be overturning old precedents, right? And there's the long running kind of reply that the originalists say, well, look, Congress can't violate the Constitution; we strike their stuff down. Why should we be able to violate the Constitution by having old decisions that are contrary to it? So there's kind of three different variables, and I think precedent interacts with them in different ways. So that's my take. Yeah.
I think there's actually tension between traditionalism and stare decisis on the modern view of stare decisis that Professor DiGirolamo, Mark, was outlining, and that will create an interesting question about the future of Second Amendment law. In the Second Amendment, because the court had not been meaningfully enforcing it until 2008, there's almost no precedent. And that's why they're able to look to historical practices of lawmakers and state actors of various kinds to figure out its contours. But we will see if that lasts. And I say that because every time a new precedent comes down, because it's treated not just as accretive, cumulative evidence of the people's will, which could be defeasible, but as once and for all declaration of what the law timelessly is, over time, and because it's easier to interpret than historical practices, as I was saying, and it's easier to find. You just need a Westlaw password. You don't need to go searching history. Over time, it has a tendency to crowd out historical practice as a lodestar for interpretation, and it tends to freeze historical practices because we're in a judicial supremacist world where everybody says, well, the court has spoken, so we all have to get in line. If the court, based on tradition and practice, declares a certain kind of state action unconstitutional, it's very hard for the people's practices to continue to shape that area of law because now they're stuck, given the way we understand judicial precedent. So it's possible that as soon as the court tries to base the doctrine in a particular area on historical practices, it will undermine its ability to keep doing so. And the democratic values that drive it to look to practice, as in Justice Kavanaugh's opinion in Rahimi that the professor was mentioning, will be ultimately violated by the very effort to honor them.
Thank you all for your talks. My name's Alex, and my question is directed to Dr. Girolamo. Is that how you pronounce it?
DiGirolamo. Emphasize the raw.
Okay.
Like a roaring lion.
Roaring line of tradition.
So I actually kind of want to explore your characterization of why you think tradition, why you think a person submits when he follows any traditional practice, whatever that might be. For instance, we submit, like as Catholics, we submit to the authority of the magisterium and its tradition, but we practice our faith. Our faith is three. We are able to basically have liberty in the practice of our faith, and that liberty also extends in the flip side under the legal traditions of our republic. So my main question is, do you think practices are binding, as in like, do you think when someone practices a tradition that they've inherited from their historical past or their Republican institution, is the authority submissive, or is the practice submissive?
So here's, I think, an answer that's, I hope, responsive. Our practices, and this is going to sound like warmed over Alistair McIntyre. Our practices.
That's still good, Mac.
It's warmed over, but hey, us we lawyers, that's what we do. We take what we find in the people that really do the thinking, and we see what works for us. Our practices, and I think of legal practices this way, and I think of religious practices, and I think of practices like sports, for example, or like cooking. You submit to an authority with respect to, and I think I understand the question maybe as I'm working it out, you submit to the authority that has told you over time what is good in that practice, what it is to play it well, to play, I don't know, I'm not supposed to talk about soccer in these right? We got football. What it is to play football well.
You're still talking about soccer.
Right, I'm still, yeah, exactly, thank you.
Or
What it is to how it is that we worship well, we think well, and we gain freedom precisely because we submit. So worlds are opened up to us, worlds to excel in those practices, to express ourselves, to be free within those practices in a much richer way than would ever be available to us if we had never submitted to them in the first place. So I think that's best I can do at the moment, but I think that's the way that I would frame, let's say, the relationship of submission and freedom, if that's answering the question.
Way over there, yeah, Kevin.
So I just wanted to get back on some of the common law and tradition points. Professor Pojanowski, you mentioned Simpson's article on common law as tradition. And one of the problems Simpson raises in that article, sort of counter-argument he addresses, is if the common law is seen only as tradition, well, you don't have a promulgating authority necessarily. There's not some sort of sovereign that's necessarily giving you the common law. It comes through practice. It comes through judges just giving the sense of common tradition. And I guess how do you, just for any of the professors, how do you approach this problem? Do you take sort of Holmes's view that, well, it's actually the judges who are the articulate sovereign giving that promulgation, or if you take the more traditionalist practice view that Simpson's advocating, how do you get around that?
Okay, so I think there's an in-between position. I don't want to be Holmes. Whatever I am, I don't want to be Holmes. So how to not be Holmes? Unfortunately, I end up being a little mini Dworkin on this. So I think, to my great regret, I think that when you pay attention to the practices, so just to stick with my running example of the early regulations that supposedly set the contours of the Second Amendment, even though nobody talked about the contours they thought they were acting on when they passed the regulation. What's going on there, if I'm right, that there's no belief you could discover by triangulation, or at least very often no belief? I think what's going on there is a kind of charitable reconstruction. The judge starts out with their own views about what would be reasonable regulation or not, permissible regulation or not. Then they notice, so suppose they thought that a certain kind of regulation would be unconstitutional, but then they notice that for hundreds of years, a majority of the states were adopting regulations of that kind. What's the principle they draw from that if there's no mental state there to discover? I think they have to look at those regulations and ask themselves, if, contrary to what I think, those were reasonable regulations, what would be the likeliest explanation of their reasonableness? What principle would make most sense of why these regulations were okay? And that principle will be a proposition. Since it's a proposition, it'll have a level of generality built into it. It will be a response to what the people did, not what the judge wants, because by hypothesis in my scenario, the judge thought the opposite. But it won't be the proposition the people gave us in history. It'll be the proposition that the judge, being charitably interpreting what the people did, comes up with himself or herself. I think, unfortunately, that's Dworkinian fit and justification. And I think that's the best we can do. in the kinds of settings you're talking about.
So before we break and thank our panelists, I want everybody to go on the social media platform of your choice and tweet out or whatever it is that Sharif Gerges is now a Dworkinian. And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists.